everyone, this is Rajarshi Sengupta and we are in the week 2 of the course, that is visual threads of visual knowledge. So in this case, what we are doing today in this lecture will be focusing on the Kanchipuram sarees of Tamil Nadu, and in this discussion what we'll try to do is to try understanding that some of the salient features of the Kanchipuram or Kanjivaram sarees of Tamil Nadu, and then also its relationship to the architecture in the vicinity, as well as like architectural theories. So we will start discussing the idea of this Kanchipuram sarees, but before that I just wanted to show these two kinds of fabric that we find in this area. So Kanchipuram district in Tamil Nadu is there as famous for its temple architecture, as well as it has been the seat of many of the dynasties at least since the 7th century. And so in this region what we find that simultaneously there are many kinds of craft making that had existed, that has survived, at the same time they have flourished, and among them of course that silk brocade making is one of them. And I wanted to show the silk brocade, the one we see on the right side of the screen, side by side with the ones which are definitely not silk brocade but the regular cotton weaving. So we find that both cotton and silk weaving have existed in this region for quite some time, and as I have already mentioned that this brocade silk sarees or any kind of garment is not something that we see people to use them on a daily basis, but they are always reserved for particular occasions, usually the auspicious occasions. Now for that reason we can also see that in the region we will find that there are many different kinds of cloth which are found, and a lungi that we have in the left side of the screen that comes from mid 19th century, 1855, also shows that how the stripes, at the same time the arrangement of the weft threads, different weft threads that sort of makes this the stripes, whether the thinner stripes or the broader stripes, to be prominent on the body of this wearable fabric. Now on the other hand, when we see this, that the particular kind of Kanchipuram sarees that we have, they are mostly known for the ones which are used in the weddings, and they are also considered to be something that had been used as heirlooms, that which are passed on in generations. That one saree would be worn by the senior members of a family, and then it would be passed on to people, the younger ones in the family. So this is how we find that how this kind of sarees, they do not just have their value for craft skill or their luster and of course their visual appearance, but also they become very much part of the familial histories and the way a community interacts with them in the larger spectrum of culture. Now the kind of sarees that we see in Kanchipuram, and especially the silk brocade sarees and the traditional ones, the ones we see fitted for the purpose of wedding or the auspicious occasions, are called the korvai sarees, and which are woven in this korvai technique. In this korvai technique that we find there, and that is something that is very specific to making the Kanchipuram sarees. So the communities of the weavers that we find in the Kanchipuram area, and they will be predominantly from two groups, and one would be the Padmasaliyar community or the Padmashali community. So the Padmasaliyar community are the ones who are thought to have migrated from parts of Andhra Pradesh today, the Telugu speaking regions, and then they have migrated and settled in the Kanchipuram region for centuries. Now they are the ones who are worshippers of Markandeya Rishi, or and of course Lord Vishnu, and for that reason what we find that they believe in this this origin myth in which Markandeya Rishi was the one who was considered to be the first weaver who had woven a fabric out of lotus stem yarn. So we do not know that, I mean, if a particular kind of weaving is associated with that or not, but that is the story that we hear. Now for that reason, like, I mean, another the patron saint for the Padmasalyar community, we find that, I mean, that is Bhavna Rishi. And then we also have the Devanga communities, and the Devanga communities are also the ones we find them predominantly in the Telugu speaking region, both in Telangana as well as in coastal Andhra. So this communities, we see that, I mean, they have stayed in the Kanchipuram region for centuries, and they have excelled making this particular kind of Korvai sarees. So in Korvai saree that we find, and where, like, I mean, textile scholar Aarti Kaura argues that Korvai sarees are not something that is understood as as a piece of fabric, even though saree is definitely, it's an untailored piece of fabric which is not stitched anywhere, and that's the reason it is wrapped around the body and worn in that way. But the thing is that, I mean, how this particular kind of sari is different perhaps from a lungi that does not have border, that does not have a frontispiece, or perhaps it also differs from its usage. It can be a ritualistic use, it can also be used in the cultural setting. So all these things, something that, I mean, how Aarti Kaura, textile scholar Aarti Kaura, she argues, for that reason we find that Korvai sari is something that is understood as a complete garment and not just stitched piece of fabric. So this idea of the garment that we find in this case, that, I mean, why this Kanchipuram sarees, the Korvai sarees are considered as this complete garment, is something that we find that it does not really stay only in the materials that is used for making the saree or the particular kind of technique, but also like the kind of belief systems, but and also the way we see that, I mean, the sari as a body is something that, I mean, perhaps something that breathes, something that also grows with people. So those ideas we find that to be much ingrained in this idea of the Korvai sarees, which sets it apart from the other kind of brocade sarees, as well as the other kind of woven fabric that we find the wearers would wrap them around their body like a lungi. So what happens in this particular kind of brocade, that we find that it is predominantly silk, and sometimes, I mean, of course it is in silk, and sometimes we also have zari, which is used with silk for executing the motifs. In this case we do have the warp, and then, like, I mean, there is one layer of the weft, that is the continuous weft, and on the top of that we also have the supplementary wefts which would be used for making the motifs. And this is again something that we can understand that it is done in this draw loom, or today a lot of times we also find that how the punch cards from inspired from the jacquard looms are used there for executing these motifs, these complex motifs that we have on the surface of these sarees. Now the other thing that we find that, I mean, when these Korvai sarees are made, perhaps it is not very clear in this image, but the borders are considered to be different, separate from the body of the sari. And then there are also clear marks in these cases where we can find how the borders are joined during the weaving technique. And so what happens in this case, that, I mean, the border is something that is understood as a separate entity, and then the body of the sari is considered as the separate entity, and then of course the frontispiece or the palla here that we have here. So this is also something that we understand as, like, I mean, three separate entities are there which would be sort of joined together through the technique of making the sari, as well as through joining of these three symbolic elements into a sari, which makes a complete garment. So these are some of the things we find in these cases. And perhaps what we also find that, I mean, there are, when these borders are joined to these sarees, there are specific kind of ways in which we see that the color, and then, like, I mean, the distribution of motifs and everything that work out. So for example, in this cases what we find that there are opposition of elements which are emphasized in these sarees, as something that also, like, Aarti Kaura, she points out that if in terms of, like, I mean, if we think about the border being a separate entity from, or like a separate being from the body of the sari. In this case, in the image that we have, we clearly see that the border, this yellow border, is something that is contrasting with this dark green body, and it is a marker for the way we understand that how this two opposing elements, they're sort of like coming together in this case. And the border is not something that is appearing in one side of the sari but both sides of the sari. It can vary, but certainly we do find that how in these two cases the borders would have a different combination of color or motifs from the body part of it. Now this is also something we can understand that today we have a lot of Kanchipuram sarees which have been done with much experimentations with the intervention of the designers, as well as like the market demand. So not all sarees would be considered as this particular kind of this corvée sarees, the sarees woven in this corvée technique, but the ones we see here are like at least in this images here, we can consider them as like the much more traditional ones, which are also understood as the ones jokingly always attributed to the grandmas, or like the older generations of our society. So what we see in this, that the first thing would be the opposition of the elements that we have in these sarees, as like as the how the borders would be different, and then like the borders would always run parallel with the warp threads. And for the warp threads, that we find that it's not just one set of warp threads, but there are at least two different colors of the warp threads which will be there. And that's the reason what we also see that there are all those opposition of the elements, that the warp threads as we see in this corvée sarees are not something that is like two warp threads will be in the same color scheme, but usually they are either complementary or contrasting color schemes. And that is how like the opposition of the element that we see them in the border and the body, it will also be working out in the distribution of the warp threads as well. And for the warp threads, we also find that there are varying density of the warp threads or the yarn that is used for making this sarees. And for that reason, like the opposition is something that is not just exemplified in the use of color, but also in the mass and the density of the material that is also used for making the saree. So these are the different kind of issues that we find them, that how this opposition of the elements work out in this corvée sarees. The other thing that we also find them there are that there are balance. There is balance between the opposition elements. So how this balance is achieved is basically through how we see that even though there are contrasting colors, but they do not seem to be moving towards different direction. They do not seem to be like talking about a chaos, but they are in synchronization with each other. They combine into a body of the sari. So that is something we find, and that's the reason that the balance, the way we see them, is something that is very much there, embedded in this sari motifs, as well as like the entire distribution of color and patterns all over. So another thing we also find in this case is that in this the distribution of the color, and something that as we see that a very conscious choice of contrasting colors are used in the Kanchipuram sarees, is something that is also understood as like understood with different kind of metaphors. So in that case, we see the color symbolism that also comes up in this sarees. So for example, we have like this we have like a particular kind of sari which would have kalai malai, which means like morning, evening, so, or like Ganga Yamuna, or like Ganga Jamuni. So this kind of, and in these cases we find that at least three colors in the warp are used in these cases. And so in this kind of issues, what we find that how the metaphors of morning and evening is something that is then like sort of transferred to making of the saris. That morning is something that is understood as the starting of the day. Evening is something that is understood as the perhaps transition of the day into night or the end of the day. But then bringing these two things together is the way we see the cycle of time sort of moves on. So without these two things we cannot really find a balance, and this is a reminder that how our life and how our days and nights and everything else are also, even though they seem that they are in contrast with each other, but they are also in somehow connected. So this connectedness and of course finding a middle ground between them is something that the Kanchipuram sari weavers also strive for in making this very specific kind of saris, and that is how the Korvai saris come into being. Now with the color symbolism, we also find that there are particular kinds of colors which are definitely encouraged, but also there are particular kinds of colors which are restricted. And in that case what we find that of course one of the colors which would be discouraged for this kind of saris would be pure black, and that's because black is considered as inauspicious in many of the religious sects. And then of course black is something that is considered to be a color which is not encouraged in the marriages or in many other auspicious occasions, in the Hindu auspicious occasions. So in this case what happens that we find that in a lot of Hindu marriage rituals, how the brides are advised for not wearing something that has a combination of the color black is something that we also find that to be also reflected in the combination of the colors that we find in this Korvai saris. For the bridegrooms it's always the off-white or white colored veshti and something to wear in the upper body, upper garment. So those kind of, but for the bride it is always important in terms of how the religious the customs and this issues they sort of encircle around the choice of color that would have been there, and this kind of color would also perhaps are symbolically related to the well-being of the bride and eventually the health of the bridegroom as well. So those are the reasons we find that the color symbolism is something that not just talk about the opposition of elements and bringing them together, but also the kind of sacredness of the color, auspiciousness of the color, which colors to use, which colors to avoid. At the same time we also find that with particular colors, what kind of colors can go with what color. So even not just thinking in terms of the religious or the cultural perspectives, but also in terms of making a aesthetic value judgment that which color goes with which one. And we are not talking about monochromatic colors or the colors which fall on the same perhaps category, like red, brown, or yellow. These colors will probably not be in the same sari. If we are thinking about sari with red body and brown border, that would not be possible in the Kanchipuram saris. And so for that reason we can think what kind of contrasting color with red might go, and then those colors are selected for the borders and as well as for the palla or the frontispiece. And why I call it frontispiece, it is something also that Aarti Kaulra's discussion that sort of addresses, that when the women when the Iyer women would wear the sari so in this case what we find that the palla would usually go here on the torso, and so this is something that we see that how this palla is actually in the front, and it kind of constitutes part of the body, whereas the borders they stay in the margins, and then of course how it is that is different. Now Now, other thing that we find that that also makes the case for this sari being considered as a body, or like a complete garment, that also comes there more strongly, is because this in this Korvai saris we find that there are three parts, that the frontispiece is usually called as talaipu, which means head, and then we also have the middle section, or like the body, which is called vadal, and that also means body. And then we have the borders, which are like the ones in the margins, which are called karai, and that means boundary or river bank. So these are the kind of terms that we use, that we find them to be associated with the Korvai saris, and this is how the symbolism of the body are also ingrained in making the border, body, as well as the frontispiece of the Korvai saris. Now, with those things, we also find that a number of different kind of motifs are there in this Korvai saris, and a number of them will find them to have particular kind of relationship with the objects or elements that we find in nature. So, for example, we have a bird motif, or we have Rudraksha, or we also have this Mailkannu, that means the peacock's eyes and things like that. We also have Kamalam, or the lotus. And then very interestingly, we also have the Mallimuggu, that is the bud of the jasmine. And then we also have this very important motif that we will find all across the Indian subcontinent, and that is the Mangabtu, and that is this mango motif that we find. And this mango motif sometimes is seen as this kalka, or sometimes it is seen as this paisley motif. By the way, the paisley is a European term that was used much later than the motifs came into existence in the Indian subcontinent. However, so this mango, or which is also called Pandu motif in the Telugu speaking region, is something we will find all across the Indian subcontinent. And this all different kinds of motifs that we have, which have a direct relationship to the natural world around the weavers and then the communities, are something that we find them to be represented as ornamentation in these saris. Now, the other motif that comes up much clearly and prominently in this saris, which in English is understood as this temple motif, and as you can see here in this representation of this sari, where we see this zigzag kind of triangular formation that sort of also reminds us of a temple tower, is something that we understand as this temple motif. And I wanted to show this right beside an image of a Gopuram, and that is perhaps from the Varadaraja Perumal temple in Kanchipuram, and this photograph was taken around 1850 to 1870, and in this photograph what we have here is a representation of this Gopuram, or the gateway, the temple, and in which we find this pyramidal shape of this Gopuram that sort of rises. And also we might think that how this kind of motifs might have some kind of relationship to the temple motif. However, we will sort of look into little in depth of the kind of the relationship we want to explore with the architecture and saris, and we will probably not subscribe to a simplistic understanding of this is a temple tower and that is the temple motif, so those two things are connected. Perhaps the relationship between them is not as simple as that. So temple as a body, that we see that that has been there, which is discussed in a number of the theories of architecture, and of course when the ground plan of the temple is something that is considered. So this is diagram of the Vastu Purusha Mandala that we see there in this prolific work of Michael Meister, art historian Michael Meister. And in this case what we find that in the North Indian temple plans, Michael Meister had worked on this issue, in which we find that either this dire area, the area of the main sanctum sanctorum, the temple, in this case what we find that that is considered as this square area, which is then like, I mean, of course, then it is divided into like, I mean, either 64 or like, I mean, more than that, like, I mean, these sections. And in this cases, what we find that how the central portion, which is then attributed to Brahma, is left empty, and then like, I mean, these portions of this architecture would be filled with wall, and or like, I mean, you know, that is the place which is considered to be like, I mean, the supporting areas around the deity. So these are something that we find that, I mean, how this idea of a temple proper or like a sanctum sanctorum is something that is understood as the body of this Vastu Purusha. And here we can clearly see that, I mean, how this idea of this Vastu Purusha is also mapped onto this square diagram of the temple sanctum sanctorum. So this is something we find it there. And of course, like, I mean, how this square ground plan is something that is not just there on the ground, but it also sort of like, I mean, translates to the vertical growth of the temple as well, and that is also something we find. So this idea of the Vastu Purusha, or like this body of the Vastu Purusha, is something that is understood as which sort of like, I mean, gives the basis of any Hindu temple in the North Indian context. Of course, in the Nagara context we find it, but the thing is that, I mean, this idea of the temple as a body is something that has been sort of like, I mean, discussed in depth in Michael Meister's work. Now, even though I know that, I mean, we are talking specifically about Kanchipuram district, which would not have the same kind of like, I mean, this Vastu Purusha Mandala in this case, but we also find it there that, I mean, how some of this this key principles about like, I mean, understanding the ground plan of the temple of this body, and then like, I mean, building a temple on the top of it, which also like, I mean, symbolizes the body and everything, is something that is exemplified in the temple structures there as well. For that reason, what we see there is that, I mean, this idea of the temple architecture being something that is also associated with this sari, that, I mean, as we have already mentioned, that, I mean, in terms of like, I mean, this Korvai saris, which is very much ingrained in the Hindu ritualistic customs, of course, like, I mean, with the auspicious customs. And in this case, what we see there, that, I mean, the temple which is there side by side, which is also part of like, I mean, the religious lives of communities, as something we find in both cases, there is this emphasis on the body, that, I mean, how the temple is something that is understood as a body. And then we also see that the sari is also something that is understood as this complete garment according to Arthik Holra. And then that is also something we can extend that to understand that, I mean, it has a life of its own, almost it functions as a body. And then there are also some of the accounts in which we find that how this Korvai saris are not considered to be inauspicious when someone wears it, or like, I mean, it is not usually considered that it needs to be washed after every time it is used, because silk is something that is understood in this particular context that is already sort of like self purifies itself. So this idea of auspiciousness, sacredness, purification, and their relationship to both sari and temple are something that we find that to be much more sort of intertwined in both cases. We'll continue on this discussion more on the next lecture. Thank you.